Our reading today is taken from John chapter 11, and we're starting at verse 1. The death of Lazarus. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet, when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you are going back there." Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light." After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them more plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." Then Thomas, called Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus has already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world." And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Yes? On the back row? Kieran, I shall put you on duty. If you fail to hear me, put your hand up. That would be absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much. Got to say just before we start, it's many years since I've actually spoken at a morning service. Many years. And when I did speak, I usually refer to the latest storyline in Coronation Street or Emmerdale. A bit of an icebreaker, really. Some of you might remember that. Good news. The good news is, I don't watch them anymore, which is a problem. So the good news is I've been delivered from the bondage of Coronation Street and Emmerdale. The further bad news is I don't have an icebreaker anymore. And it gets worse. I'm now seeking ministry for delivery from Strictly Come Dancing. So if you'd like to come and pray with me later, that would be much appreciated. This is a further talk in our series of encounters with Jesus. And they're just on the screen there, just to remind you of the ones which we've gone through. And I've got the unenviable task of following on from Emma in the talk that she did last week, which was absolutely wonderful. So my subject for today is three siblings, death and resurrection. Well, sort of aware of the fact that if John Bennett was here, he'd do 3 weeks on each one of those. But fortunately, John isn't with us, so you've got me. I do hold the record, though, for the shortest ever sermon, which meant that I actually went up in Mark Brown's estimation, quite amazingly. And I get 2 thumbs up for that one, which was great. Okay, then. So then, let's have a quick look at it then. The 3 siblings, who are they? Well, we're talking about Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And although we're in John, and we're in John 11, we get the introduction to these 3 back in Luke. And we hear that was where Jesus and his disciples had gone. They were friends of Jesus. In fact, he was very close to them. In fact, it comes out through the reading that Jesus loved them. He cared about them. They were special people to him. And I actually like the story of that introduction in Luke when we hear about them. We also hear about them in John 11 and John 12. So a little bit looking backwards and a little bit looking forwards. Okay, so Jesus is at the home of Martha and Mary. We don't know where Lazarus is. He must have been out somewhere at the time. And Jesus was there and he was speaking and some disciples were there. And I get the picture that Mary was basically just sat at his feet and just lapping up everything he had to say. Jewish society was such that women very rarely were in a situation where they'd be sort of so close to the person who's effectively the rabbi in that situation. But there she is there, lapping up everything he has to say. And Martha was there too. And Martha was doing a brilliant job because she was the host. But whilst Mary was sitting at the feet of Jesus, Martha was washing the pots. I wonder who you identify with. Would you be sitting at the feet of Jesus and listening to everything that he has to say? or would you be busy washing the pots? Might be worthwhile thinking about that a little bit later. Let's have a look at what the incident really is. We now focused on a family, and a family in turmoil, because Lazarus is ill. In fact, he's gravely ill. He is very, very seriously ill. And they are desperate because they can see that Lazarus is deteriorating. And so they're reaching out. And in particular, they're reaching out to Jesus. They know that Jesus can move in this situation. And they know that Jesus could just outstretch his hand. And they believe that Jesus could heal him. So they sent for him. Lord, the one you love is sick. Come now. You can imagine the desperation in it. It's very difficult when you're with somebody who's very, very ill. It's very difficult when you're staring death in the face. It can be the darkest of times. And it's at times like this that your faith can take an absolute battering. The concept of death is very much a taboo in today's society. It's difficult. And I'm ever so conscious of the fact that there are people within the congregation who have faced death face to face, as it were, in the current days and in recent months. I suppose to a degree we've all felt a little bit of it with the death of the Queen. I think for so many people they felt they'd lost their grandmother or they'd lost their mother. It was a bit like that. But the prospects of losing someone, it's just so hard to deal with. It can bring unbearable pain and an unbearable suffering. So what do? You reach out. One of the things we need to remember, though, is, as Ecclesiastes tells us, there is a time for everything. And there is a time for death. And we can't bear it. We can't think about it. You know, a time for everything under the season, a time to be born, and a time to die. But somehow or other, when you're going through it, that doesn't seem to be sort of relevant anymore. Very, very hard times. So, when Jesus heard this, his immediate response was, this is not going to end in death. You see, the difference is that we look at everything from an earthly perspective, but he looks at it from a different perspective because Jesus knows the future. He knows the end from the beginning, and he knows the outcome. He knows this is going to be all right, but they don't, and they're panicking. The prospect of losing Lazarus is something they just absolutely can't cope with. They can't even, it's uppermost in their minds, but it was the last thing that they wanted to think about. Yes, the scriptures are very clear on this. Jesus loved Martha and her sister Mary and Lazarus. He was 2 miles away. We stayed where he was. Hard, isn't it? As human beings, we would beg that question. Why didn't you do something? If you loved them, why didn't you go? But the thing was, you see, that Jesus, knowing the end from the beginning, he just knew that there was something great that was going to come out of this. This is going to be something that would be with him 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years hence, when people will still be talking about what's going to happen as a result of this. So after a time of period had passed, after 2 days, he said, right, okay, to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. Let's go back to this place. And immediately the reaction of the disciples was, why? They tried to stone you last time. Are you sure you want to do this? This is not good. But no, Jesus knew he had to go back there. Our friend Lazarus, he's fallen asleep. I'm going to be there. I'm going to go with him. And the disciples, as ever we would do, misunderstood it. They thought, no, he's not dead. He's just sleeping. And sleep's good for you, and at the end of it, you probably feel a lot better. Yes, Jesus, okay, we get it. And then Jesus made it very clear, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there. Sometimes it's so difficult to understand spiritual things with our human mind and our human emotions. So on arrival, he got there. He realized that Jesus was already dead. And he'd been in the tomb for 4 days. He was definitely dead. Now, that sounds a very glib comment, but the reason for it is that in Jewish culture, there's the belief that the soul or the spirit stayed with the body for at least 3 days. So if this was going to be a miracle, and if this is going to be seen and being observed by so many people, you didn't want to be in the situation where people could turn around and say, oh, it's all right, he was in a coma. Then Jesus has said the words, so he wasn't really dead at all. But one thing we do know, not only was he dead, but his body had already begun to decompose. The evidence was there. So Martha heard that Jesus was coming. He was on his way. Mary stayed at home. We can understand why she stayed at home, I think. But Martha went out to meet him. And those heartbreaking words, if you'd have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Imagine the thoughts going through her mind at that time. Disappointed, doesn't go anywhere near it, let down, broken-hearted. She's in the depth of grief. And it's a bit like, you could have done something. You were 2 miles away. Why didn't you come? Why didn't you do it? There are various theories about grief. And one of the things that came out of it when I was looking at this is that as you go through various stages of grief, there are certain things which abide with you, sometimes for a long time. Depression is one of them. When you're in a situation of losing a loved one, you go through all the things like, the shock of losing them, even though they may have been ill for an awful long time. Not being able to accept it, not being able to believe it. Being angry. And sometimes that is meaning being angry at God. Why have you done this? He was a good person. She was a good person. Why did you do it? And then the bargaining. If you reach out and you touch him and you heal him, I'll go to church every Sunday. I'll never miss. I'll double my offering. Please, God, do something. But ultimately, it's a time for testing. And it's also a time when eventually we get to a situation where we need to accept the situation. She's nowhere near any of these at the moment. But Jesus then said, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me, he will live. And then went on to challenge her and say, do you believe it? Do you believe it? And of course, Martha's response to that was, of course. He's standing with her. He knows these words. This is Jesus actually declaring himself God. He's putting himself in a situation where he's actually going to be saying, I am the resurrection. Do you believe it? Martha tried to rationalize it. She began to query this, but, he's been dead. He's been dead. His body's beginning to decompose. I believe you're the resurrection and the life, Jesus, but how is this going to work? Martha went back and spoke to Mary. and said, Mary, Jesus is asking for you. And when Mary heard this, she got up quickly and left the funeral party, as it were, and went to meet with him. Lord, if you'd have been here, my brother would not have died. Where have you laid him, he asked. Come and see. Jesus could see the heartbreak. Jesus felt the heartbreak. Jesus, totally God, but totally man, totally identified with what was going on here. And we believe and we hear and we read that Jesus began to cry. Such was his heart for Mary and for Martha and for Lazarus. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will be with you, says the Lord. Some people around saw this, and their response to it was, just see how he loved him. We don't quite know the emotions that was going through Jesus' mind at that time. But those around him were beginning to say, he's the one who made the blind man see. Why did he not do anything? Take away the stone, Jesus said. Martha, but it's too late, Lord. He's dead. Take away the stone. Did I not tell you that you would see the glory of God, Jesus said. So they took the stone away. Jesus then apparently prayed, and it was, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. And then the command. Jesus said, Lazarus, come out. And at that stage, we saw the picture of the dead man who once was dead and is now restored to life, and life breathed back into him. An absolute, utter miracle. And all the people that were around him, they couldn't decry it. There was just so many people that had seen that this had happened. They were able to attest to the fact that Lazarus had definitely died, and Jesus had definitely caused him to rise again from the dead. What was the outcome of it? Many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary, they basically couldn't believe it. This was the most significant thing that had happened so far, but it was very significant in the life of Jesus, because this was going to set him on the course to Calvary. People marveled, but other people sent word to the authorities, and they weren't happy about it. Basically, this made both Jesus and Lazarus a marked man. Let's get rid of him, and let's get rid of the evidence. This was very, very significant. Also significant that we read in John chapter 12, which is the next passage along, that there was then a gathering again at Martha and Mary's home. And Lazarus is there, very much alive, reclining as it were, and there they were sharing their words together. And there we have the picture of Mary anointing the feet of Jesus with ointment and with spices and something so special, it was the equivalent of a year's salary. That was how precious that was. And yet there was one who observed what was going on, a person called Judas. He said, what are you doing that for? What a complete waste of money. You could be giving that money to the poor. It's quite interesting, isn't it, for somebody who'd actually been robbing from the purse because he was the treasurer of the group of people that was there. Oh, that the Lord must have been so upset in seeing that. And Mary anointed the feet of Jesus. And Martha washed the pots. Well, somebody's got to wash the pots, haven't they? Somebody has got to do the things which are needed. I've got to say, this is a beautiful picture of devotion and a beautiful picture of love. What it shows us is really, and I look at this, I always think, Mary, what such a really spiritual person, a really, really, devout woman who absolutely wanted to do everything that Jesus wanted them to do. So here was the event. This was the miracle. Significant, isn't it, that this resurrection is also a picture of what was going to happen with Jesus? Or wasn't it significant that there were 3 days before Good Friday and the resurrection? He had to be seen to be dead to prove that he was alive and alive forevermore. What can we learn from this? Right. Who do you identify with? Are you sitting at the feet of Jesus? Or are you running around like an earwig, doing all the things that you feel you have to do? There's a time to run around like an earwig, and there's a time to rest, a time to be born, and a time to die. Has your faith been shaken? Shaken by suffering? The prospects of losing a loved one? Or the reality of having lost a loved one? And has that caused you to fall out with God? I'm saying that because that can happen. And sometimes we just have to come back to God and realize that He is God. He understands the way that we feel. And even if you feel, that some sort of anger towards God, bring it to Him. I'd like my children, if they were annoyed with me, to tell me about it so that I'd be able to do something about it to settle their heart and to settle their minds. In all of this, can we ask the question, do we trust that Jesus will go through those valley of the shadow of death with us? I believe there are very profound truths in John 11. Death is very, very significant, but so was resurrection. And put those two together, and you realize that there is hope. And that hope can be found in Almighty God. Lord bless you. Amen.